Hello and welcome. Today's presentation is stretching forages to meet your cow's needs this winter. I'm Zach Carlson, the Extension Beef Cattle Specialist here at NDSU. My office is in Fargo, and with that, we'll get started. I'd like to first look at the energy requirements of a cow given her stage of production. So if we think about a 1,400 pound cow, we're in late gestation at this point, looking to calve somewhere, between now, of course, January to probably April or so for most people. And so we're in that late gestation approaching calving. And we can see the cycle there, that red line, as we move from calving and lactation all the way to where we are now in late gestation. These energy requirements are relatively low through this fall for a spring calving herd into now we're starting to creep up in late gestation, moving from 11 or 12 megacalories up to 16, 17 megacalories right before calving. And so this is an important point, as the rest of today's talk is really talking about stretching forages and what to do with lower quality forages, things that you've most likely already been dealing with this fall. But I think for a frame of reference and to get an idea, it's good to keep in mind what our actual energy and protein requirements are. That same line now, same units of measure, I've just kind of outlined to partition what actually is occurring here. So of course we can see the blue line is what we call maintenance, just to keep the cow's system operational, right? Keep the cow alive. And so we can see on the right hand side, if this was a March 1st calving cow, essentially where we are in January, that we're starting to increase those energy requirements substantially due to the pregnancy there. And of course you can see that on the left, the yellow bar signifying the lactation demand. And so really we can kind of see how things work through a spring calving herd from weaning in September, October, November into where we are right now and where those cows are headed. Protein follows a very similar fashion here. Essentially what we have on the left hand side is a percent of the diet that the diet needs to contain, so level of protein right around 8 to say 10% protein as we move from that late gestation into calving. So with that, kind of just as a table overarching covering our second trimester, or mid-gestation, late gestation, early lactation, and mid-lactation, in reference to the net energy megacalories, or if you operate on a TDN, that's pounds of TDN per day, and pounds of crude protein per day, because cows don't have a dry matter intake requirement. What they do have is a nutrient requirement, so both that of energy and protein. And so just to kind of give us a frame of reference here, I have a 1,300 pound mature cow, kind of what we're dealing with in that third trimester, about 12 to 12.5 pounds or megacalories, and then about 2 pounds of crude protein. So what is your hay quality? Really, I partition these hay quality scenarios into 4 different categories. Within high quality, there's an abundant supply or limited supply. More likely this year, we saw a very limited supply of our hay production. And then there's low quality, whether that be abundant supply through wheat straw, cattails, prairie hay, or some type of CRP, or a limited supply potentially even there. And these categories we'll discuss a little bit further in the presentation, can be impacted based on how you need to supplement your herd, based on the requirements that you need to meet through additional supplementation, maybe of a grain or a highly digestible fiber source or something like that. That will play an important role considering what your supply scenario is here, with either an abundance or limited supply, regardless of high quality or low quality. And the table on the right really is just to demonstrate what I'm considering low quality would be something of 6% crude protein and a 50% or lower TDN. So obviously wheat straw, cattails, CRP hay, corn stover all kind of fall into that category relative to those reference hays and forages above. So what I have here is really, once you've established what scenario of hay quality you have, there's most likely going to be a point, whether it has already occurred or is occurring here in the near future as you approach calving season, where you're going to need to supplement the forage quality that you have and supplement those cows with additional energy or protein. And which one is it will kind of depend on your situation with your forage quality analyses and kind of looking at how much of each of those forages that you actually do have, and then I'll try to highlight a little bit of kind of the differences between those based on your forage scenario. So what we have is partitioned the protein sources and energy sources, and you can see those there. Most likely, beet pulp and distillers grains may be readily available depending on contracts and supply in your area. But I think of beet pulp, corn silage. Those are going to be energy supplements. And then on the protein side, soybean meal might actually work this year, depending on what you can get it for relative to, say, distillers grains or something like that. And then of course some urea through lick tubs and things along those lines. But what I've put in the middle there is distillers grains, corn gluten feed, and alfalfa. And I've put those there because what those are different from the others is basically through the fact that they're a highly digestible fiber and they're bringing in a relatively high amount of crude protein. And so I kind of see those as middle ground between energy and protein. But when you do consider supplementing, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, but you can kind of think of replacing forage, stretching your forage inventory through supplemental grain or byproducts at about a pound of grain might displace about 1.5 pounds to 2 pounds of forage. That's a rule of thumb and not necessarily applies in all situations, and I'll show you some of those. But you can kind of think in some degree to some level that rule of thumb there. Now what I've listed here is the nutrient composition, of course, of many different feeds. And my goal is at least to orientate ourselves with the protein and TDN or megacalories, if that's the way you operate, on some of these, energy feeds of corn, utilizing kind of corn as the standard here in this situation. Going to what I was saying about corn gluten feed or distillers grains, you can see there right below corn, bringing in a relatively high level of crude protein as well as a high TDN value. And you can see my TDN value for distillers grains is actually above 100%. And that's simply due to the fact that there's some highly digestible fiber, but the way the animal processes some of that extra protein can actually be converted into energy. And so it accounts for a little bit more in the TDN equation, and therefore has a pretty high TDN value. We can see wheat middlings fits in there pretty well, depending on your location and what the supply of that can be. And then, of course, beet pulp, as I said, along with then those other forages. So given the area and the location in the northeast here, there is a relatively abundant supply of potential feed sources given this area. So beet pulp, of course, and other beet tailings maybe, or other sources from beets, as well as then wheat mids coming from a mill potentially, and then ethanol production and getting distillers grains or corn gluten feed depending on the production. And so really relative abundance, but I should say relative abundance of potential for co-products. I do understand oftentimes contracts play a big role, and supply, and then of course maintaining that supply can be pretty tricky. So what we're looking at to start things off with supplementing strategies is 1,000-pound steers were tested either with no supplement or soybean meal. And the low quality hay they were fed at free choice as much as they could was 5.2% crude protein and 40%, you can see there, 39.9% TDN. So very low quality forage, but something that might look pretty similar in cases today. So if we look under dry matter intake, what they monitored was basically the amount of forage those animals ate and the energy density of that. And so what we can see, what I've highlighted there, is that the forage intake alone, without accounting for the soybean meal, was 10.7 pounds for the steers consuming no supplement. For the steers supplemented, and I've put there 1.6 pounds of soybean meal daily, those steers, those 1,000-pound steers, consumed 18.4 pounds of forage. So a 72% increase there from no supplement to providing just under 2 pounds of soybean meal daily. So large bump in the amount of forage intake of those animals. And going back to our forage scenarios, right? Thinking about, do you have an abundant supply of low quality forage, much like this forage, or do you have a limited supply? And this year, if you're in that limited supply category, it's important to consider protein versus energy sources, and we'll dive even deeper into some of this. But you can see essentially that in a situation like this, if you have an abundant supply of forage there, what I've highlighted at the very bottom is actually the pounds of energy those steers consume. So 4.2, almost 4.3, and 8.5 for the ones supplemented with soybean meal. So those steers that were supplemented just 1.6 pounds of soybean meal consumed twice as much energy because they increased their intake of that forage. And that's important to understand and take advantage of low quality forage by supplying a protein supplement if you have the low quality forage to feed, and certainly can be a situation that fits your operations needs. To expand upon that here, what I want to talk about is forage intake work done at Oklahoma State here not that long ago. So these were mid-gestation cows, about 1,200-pound cows, mature cows, and they were provided in a similar scenario as the previous study I talked about. They were provided a low-quality hay that was 5.6% crude protein and 50% TDN, so a little bit better than the last study. And what they did was they looked at the intake of these cows and they supplemented. So the blue bar there, we're looking at dry matter intake, the blue bar, cows were supplemented a couple pounds of cottonseed hulls. So essentially limited amounts of protein, more of an energy supplement. And so when we looked at cows that were then supplemented, a 50-50 mix of wheat midds and cottonseed meal at 3.5 pounds there, the red bar. And then we have 3 levels of distillers grains, 1.7 in green, 3.4 in purple, and 5 pounds in blue. And essentially what you see is there's an immediate 26% increase going from the cottonseed whole cows to the wheat midds, cottonseed meal, and that really kind of maintains. There's not a whole lot of difference between those, a little bit lower for those distillers, but pretty similar in terms of dry matter intake when we start providing, in a low quality scenario, a protein supplement to mid-gestational cows here. To expand upon this study, now if we look at digestible dry matter intake, essentially a measure of available nutrients to those cows. Again, similar thing to what we saw with the steers consuming just 1.6 pounds of soybean meal, that when these cows received a protein supplement, whether that was wheat midds, cottonseed meal, or distillers grains, the digestible energy intake increased in those diets. And so essentially increasing forage intake, but also maximizing utilization of that low quality forage. So again, going back to the low quality scenario where there's an abundant supply, protein supplementation can work in a lot of those scenarios. Now what we have here, looking at supplementing corn for substitution of hay and looking at forage intake there. This is some older data, but it was mature cows, non-pregnant cows utilized here. And essentially what they did was holding crude protein constant. They supplemented corn. So they brought in basically, if you look on the left-hand side, you can see at the bottom 0, 2.2, 4.4, and 6.6 pounds of corn supplemented daily. And you can see the impact that had on hay intake there. I should mention the quality of the hay was 4.2% crude protein, so fairly low quality grass hay. And what we saw here was that essentially as you increase supplemental corn, you decreased forage intake. Now that sounds like a good plan and something that might work in most cases, reducing, again, stretching that hay quality, hay inventory, right? But however, if you look on the right-hand side, those black bars, that is the amount of energy intake that those cows were taking in on a daily basis. And so what you actually see there is the right-hand side, 4.4 and 6.6 pounds, were actually lower in the amount of energy intake than the the non-supplemented cows. And so with that spike there at 2.2 pounds, the reason really for this is that as you increase corn, you would think you're increasing the energy overall, which you could be. However, in these situations where forage is the main diet component, you're in a forage-based system, you actually are causing a bit of negative associative effects within the microbial digestion, which essentially just means you're bringing a starch in through corn supplementation, which is not favorable in a primarily forage-based rumen environment. There's a lot of bacteria that do not cater towards corn supplementation, and you end up getting these negative effects within the system where you get a lot less forage digested. And so although you're decreasing forage intake, you can see here you're not really maximizing your low quality forage. And so this could work in a case where you decrease forage intake, but just to let you know, you're not going to ultimately increase energy intake except for at those lower levels. So for a frame of reference, I usually consider corn supplementation or any grain to be about 0.3 to 0.4% of body weight. That gets you somewhere between 2 to 4 pounds is a good area to look at supplementing these grains for an energy source in your low quality hay situations. So here we have some work done at NDSU. This utilized steers and looked at supplementing barley. So again, a similar situation to the corn, and my graphs here are set up in a very similar way. So what we have was the protein of this hay was a little bit better at 10% crude protein, so mid-level grass hay quality. And then essentially what we have is the green portion of the bar is forage intake, and the yellow portion is the supplement on top of that. So essentially providing 1.70, 1.75, 3.5, and 5.2 pounds of barley. And you can see there, as you increase supplemental barley, you decreased forage intake. Again, something that might be favorable if you need to stretch your hay inventory. However, over on the right, you can kind of see that there wasn't as much of an increase in the energy intake across those levels. So there was a bump at 1.75, and then beyond that wasn't really all that different between those three levels. Now, the reason you might think it's more favorable to go to that 5-pound level and reduce your forage intake above that 8% might be something of interest. You just want to caution again, going back to, you'll be supplementing a very fermentable starch in that highly digestible with a forage based rumen environment. And so within that consideration, you want to make sure you're monitoring those animals. Something that was different and managed here was that those barley supplements were provided half in the morning and half at night, and that might have actually helped with the observed energy intake, and the reason why we didn't see that decrease like we did with the corn at higher inclusion levels. So again, going back to that 0.3 to 0.4% of body weight is more probably the target you should shoot for to avoid acidosis and other issues related to your forage digestion, and limit your risks on that side of things. So now we've covered a couple maybe of the more common grains here. I wanted to make sure to touch on some work here done at Oklahoma State, and looked at soy hull supplementation. So soy hulls really are a higher digestible fiber, and certainly as we think and hear about some of these soybean crushing plants coming to this state, there could be potential for a lot of soy hull availability, and certainly is something worth noting and talking about, I think. So in this situation, we had mature non-pregnant cows consuming grass hay that was of low quality, 4.1% crude protein. And my graphs are set the same way. Green, the portion of green there on the left-hand side is the forage intake, and the yellow is the supplemental soy hull intake. And so you can actually see when we're providing with soy hulls, we actually saw an increase in forage intake at that 2.2 pounds of soy hulls. And then the 4.4 pounds kind of comes back to level of forage intake similar to zero. And then we saw a further reduction at 6.6 pounds of soy hulls. And so as we think about kind of the energy then intake on the right-hand side, those black bars, we actually see kind of a stair-stepped increase in energy intake as we increase soy hulls. The primary reason for this is soy hulls is not a starch-based grain, and it's a highly digestible fiber. And so we're not causing those impacts we could see with corn or wheat or barley with those negative effects on fiber digestibility. We're not seeing those here because we're not causing that disruption like we do with starch-based grains. And so something to note, especially as we think about the availability here in this state of soy hulls being more and more, depending on how those price into your operation, worth considering in terms of improving energy supplementation. Next, then, I think is really all not that uncommon and probably pretty traditional in the sense of supplementing alfalfa hay with low quality hay to as we talk about third trimester and approaching calving. I'm sure it's something quite commonly used here in this state. And so some work out of Kansas State utilized yearling steers and basically fed them. Now I have this as in pounds here, but fed them as a percent of their body weight in alfalfa hay. And you can see the prairie hay quality was really, really low at 2.1 crude protein, and the alfalfa hay they supplemented was 16.8% crude protein. So the green line represents a forage intake, and then the yellow line represents the alfalfa hay intake. And so you can kind of see across there a slower reduction there of the forage intake, the low quality forage, as we increase alfalfa hay. Not really all that surprising. Then over on the right hand side, you see a large increase in the amount of energy intake that those animals received. And so what I want to highlight and show here is that similar to the soy hulls, we're not interrupting the digestibility parameters within that rumen when we're bringing in alfalfa hay. We're not bringing in a starch-based grain in this situation, of course, and so we're not impacting forage digestibility to the near extent that some of those grains are. And so another great way to bring in not only energy but protein as well in this situation. I think it works quite well and has been well demonstrated through the research. Moving now and looking at some work done here at NDSU out at the Central Grasslands Research Extension Center, looking at low quality hay and some different supplemental strategies. What they did was they had 80 pregnant cows, about 1,300 pounds or so, and they split them into 4 treatments, so 20 cows per treatment. Each treatment group of 20 got allocated 40 bales for the experiment, and they allowed 4 bales a time. So they moved a hot fence through these and bale grazed these 40 bales. So the treatments were then low quality hay, which was CRP hay of 7.5% crude protein and about 52% TDN. And that was allocated to all of these groups. And so the first treatment group would have only received the CRP hay. The next group would have received, for every 3 bales of CRP, they got 1 bale of alfalfa hay. And then the third treatment was basically the CRP hay was poured with 9 gallons of liquid supplement to increase. The idea there was to increase the crude protein content of those bales by 3%. So moving it from about 7 to 10% crude protein. And then the last one was providing distillers grains in addition to the low quality hay, and supplementing that twice a week at 4 pounds each per head at those 2 time points. And so what they saw was basically, if we looked at daily gain of these cows, again, mid-gestation cows, winter grazing these bales, what they saw was that really the body weight gain pretty well maintained for that low quality hay group. Again, we're probably approaching meeting their requirements in mid-gestation of these cows at that 7.5% crude protein, 52% TDN. That's probably pretty close to what those cows actually needed. And so in a good winter, those cows would have maintained just fine. However, if you're looking at a situation where you wanted to add some weight to your cows, you've evaluated condition coming off pasture, we got through mid-gestation now, and you really want to kind of kick it up a notch now, you want to look at some of these different supplementation strategies. And so we see that, whether you poured your bales with that 9 gallons here of liquid supplement or provide alfalfa hay, we saw pretty similar average daily gains of about 0.5 pound a day gain. And then over on the right here, we saw that we actually had a much larger improvement in average daily gain for these cows with the supplementation of distillers grains at that, again, 4 pounds twice a week. And so quite an improvement there relative to the others, but kind of depending on your situation, any one of these, I think, strategies could work, and really is dependent upon what your inventory is and what condition your cows are in. So we're pretty well past this, but I wanted to bring it up just as a discussion point with grazing corn residue. So this was a great winter up until about mid-December here to graze corn residue. We had a lot of open ground with a mild fall, and so it really was quite nice to get into those fields and graze some of this if you took advantage of that. I wanted to just talk about kind of how I look at a field in terms of stocking rate and things like that. So the main focus of corn residue grazing is to graze the leaf and the husk. It may be called corn stalk grazing, but we don't really want to graze those corn stalks. There's not quality, as I'll show you in the next slide, in that. There's a lot of quality maintained in the leaf and husk. And so there's about 16 pounds of leaf and husk per bushel of corn produced. And so knowing what the field produced in terms of corn grain, you can utilize that in terms of understanding pounds of forage that are out there and available. So I've given just a scenario where if we had 150 bushel field, 16 pounds per bushel, we've got 2,400 pounds of dry matter of higher quality forage here in this of leaf and husk per acre. And so if we consider that half of that won't be consumed and might be trampled, defecated on, blown out of the field with strong winds, let's assume we only get 8 pounds of consumable dry matter then per bushel. And so basically take that 2,400 divided by 2, and now we have 1,200 pounds of residue available to graze. And so essentially, if we think of in animal unit months, 1 animal unit month is 702 pounds of dry matter forage. So if we want to convert this number into animal unit months, we take a 1,300 pound cow, which is actually 1.3 animal units. So 1 AUM would be a 1,000 pound cow consuming 702 pounds of dry matter. So a 1,300 pound cow would be 1.3 AUMs. So we take 1.3 times 702 pounds, and that 1,300 pound cow requires about 913 pounds of dry matter. And so if you've got 9 or 1,000 pound bales, that gets you pretty close to that mark in terms of a bale per month per head, right? And so at 1.3 AUMs, we've got 913 pounds required. And so if we take 1,200 pounds of residue produced per acre, divide that by the 913 pounds of forage required for the 1,300 pound cow, we get 1.3 months or about 40 days of grazing for that. So that's kind of some of the math that I use to work through grazing corn residue. Now we want to make sure we don't have an abundance of downed ears. As I was saying, an abundance of downed ears can obviously cause us some acidosis issues. And so you want to make sure you're between that 8 to 10 bushels or no more than that of downed corn or downed ears to avoid some of that issues. But here what I've highlighted is really, again, that leaf and husk, and look at the crude protein and TDN there of those. You can really see, again, it very well could meet the protein and energy values required for these mid-gestation as, kind of time points. And so again, most likely everyone that has grazed corn residue is probably done with it, or maybe you're thinking about coming off the fields here quite soon. And so, but just something I wanted to highlight and point out. There was a study here, again, Central Grasslands Research, that looked at mid-gestation cows, so using 80 cows, and they were second and third calving cows. And what they did was they grazed corn residue. They provided 10 acres per group, and there were 8 groups, so 10 cows per 10 acres, so a cow per acre, and they grazed for 36 days. Each group did. And what they did was looked at the frequency of protein supplementation. So we've talked about energy and protein supplementation, and now I'm going to show you some work that has been repeated a lot through the years of looking at protein frequency in terms of supplementing protein across, to reduce labor and time across only several time points in a week rather than daily. And so one thing to note here is that the performance that we're about to take a look at on these cows, mid-gestation cows, was actually a little bit higher, and the reason for that was researchers noted that there was a bit of downed ears in these fields. They estimated about 16 bushels. And so if we think about the energy potential that could have in a setting, it certainly adds a lot of energy to those diets, but could potentially be, something to worry about in terms of acidosis and laminitis within your herd. But basically, again, looking at just kind of focusing on the protein supplementation and the frequency of it, they provided, again, 4 pounds per head per day, but that 4 pounds would have been allocated. So either no supplementation for the control daily at 4 pounds, or every 3 days, which would have been an allotment of, say, 12 pounds per head, right, to account for those 3 days, if that makes any sense. And then once a week at basically, or every 6 days, they supplemented. And so again, providing enough distillers across all those for 4 pounds daily, just rather being in some type of lump sum supply. And so if we look here between the daily and every 3 days, there actually it wasn't any difference in these cows in terms of gain in performance. And so again, something that these values may be a little high, and 3 pounds a day sounds like quite a bit for these cows, but the data itself is very consistent throughout the years, with the ability to supply distillers grains, or a protein I should say, infrequently through a week. And so as long as you're supplying, it looks, between about twice a week, every 3 days or so, it really doesn't show any difference from daily supplementation. And so that's important when we think about convenience, labor, and things like that. The big difference here, though, is that we're talking protein supplements. We're not talking energy. If you're going to provide energy, that needs to be on a daily basis. And so kind of to round out this discussion here on protein and energy supplementation, if you're looking at providing an energy source, 1 to 2 pounds increases energy intake, as we saw that 2 pounds of corn increased total energy without seeing an increase in that forage intake. 3 to 4 pounds a day of grain specifically for an energy supplementation decreases forage intake, right? Total forage intake will increase total energy intake when the protein requirement is met. And like I was saying, most scenarios here this year with the drought and forage production, we're more than likely limited on energy this year rather than protein, but both may be in limiting depending on what your forage analysis says. And then 3 to 6 pounds per head per day of a digestible fiber. Again, the ones we specifically I showed were soy hulls and alfalfa, but there's several others relative. Again, distillers grains would fall into that digestible fiber. Wet corn gluten feed would fall into that. Beet pulp could certainly be in that category, though it brings in a little bit more sugar rather than just digestible fiber. But those digestible fibers, primarily that distillers grains and corn gluten feed, could be fed, up to twice or 3 times a week, and be consistent there. So protein you can feed alternative days throughout the week, and energy sources have to be fed daily. So I want to switch gears now and talk about some other things that may impact or give you the ability to stretch your hay inventory. And one of those is ionophores. So ionophores are a class of antibiotics that can be found in your commercial dry or liquid supplements. You can add it to your loose mineral. And essentially what these do are, it's a class of antibiotic that attacks the gram-positive bacteria and protozoa, which really just means that they attack a specific class of bacteria that ultimately produce a less energetic organic acid as a fermentation. And so when they attack those, they actually provide space for the other organisms, other bacteria that produce a higher energetic organic acid to thrive. And so essentially you're able to produce more energy out of the same substrate or same feeds by providing an ionophore. And this has been proven over time to improve average daily gain somewhere between 5 to 15%, improve feed efficiency by 8 to 12 or so, and some work that's looked at kind of break evens, improving your break even by 1.5% or so. And so these are very versatile class of antibiotics that really, on a cost is really less than 10 cents per head per day even less than that. And so I think it fits into a lot of different operations, and we'll kind of talk specifically about Rumensin here. So Rumensin has been shown, some work here out of NDSU, to reduce intakes, dry matter intake. And so one good piece of work here done with cows looked at the reduction in dry matter intake over a period of time by providing Rumensin at 200 milligrams per head per day. And so what they saw was a 6% reduction in forage intake. And so this is quite common with supplementation of Rumensin. And so if we think about stretching inventory, forage inventory, and things along those lines, utilizing Rumensin not only improves, our average daily gain, or the amount of energy we get out of the same feed, but it actually decreases intakes too. And so it's a great way to reduce the amount of forage needed throughout a winter as we think about our different forage scenarios. The last thing I want to talk about is reducing your waste is another way to stretch your inventory. And so if you use hay feeders, something to consider is the type of hay feeder when it comes time to replace those old rusted out ones. And what we see is, through research, you can see there on the right hand side, that the more protection we put in order to maintain and not lose or have cows be able to defecate and on that hay, we see a reduction in the amount of waste, being our standard bale ring all the way down to more of our cone bottomed feeders. If you're not using those feeders but you're unrolling bales, they're simply in different years, depending on your scenario, I think it's worth considering what's convenient versus, what might help you through the winter. And so certainly rolling out 1 day's supply of hay versus rolling out 4 days supply, right, and not having to come back for a while, there's certainly convenience to that, but we can see a significant reduction in the amount of waste, up to 20%, by providing just that daily limit. We know providing 4 days supply of hay, we know a lot of that's going to get defecated on, stepped on, and wasted. And so just thinking about the access you provide to these can be another way to stretch that inventory. So with that, I just want to thank you for tuning into this video, and apologize for not being able to attend the Lake Region Roundup. I was certainly excited to be there in person and give this presentation in person, but I guess we'll shoot for next year. But please feel free to call me with any questions if you have any. Give me you can email me or call my office or cell phone, and I'd be happy to talk about anything. So thank you.